Okay, everyone, welcome to the monthly open forum. I'm Dr. Hunter Peterson. I'm a naturopathic physician and the clinic director of Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts. And this is our November open forum, which we're recording to the cloud as well and going to post to our website. The intent of this meeting is to invite a space for everyone to come together and talk about health topics from a naturopathic perspective. And if you want to participate, actively engage in this meeting, from a dialogue standpoint, just use the chat feature. I'll open it up on my computer, so I'm monitoring chats, and any questions that come across, thread them through the chat, and I will answer them at the appropriate time as I speak. So that's a way that we can kind of keep a dialogue going around the topic we're covering. Today's topic is all things immune system. So we are going to be speaking about a naturopathic perspective to understanding the immune system, how it functions, what we have it for, what happens when it doesn't function well, and some of the problems that can arise, and what are some of the things that drive it to malfunction. So it feels like a very timely topic in that we're kind of rounding into, gosh, it feels more like winter out. It's going to drop into the 20s in the next couple of days. And I have already had a big rash of acutely ill people dealing with flus and colds. And, we're just jumping right into that season where we get to talking about our immune system a lot. And, one of the big roles our immune system plays, of course, which is protecting us from infectious viruses, bacteria, fungal elements, and other pathogens, to help protect us from infections. So really good time of year to tune up on the immune system and get it working really well in that regard. But then the other side of talking about the immune system that I'm going to spend a lot of time on today is recognizing that a lot of chronic illnesses have a lot to do with a dysregulated immune system. In other words, that our immune system is malfunctioning and acting inappropriately, and that drives a lot of the symptom expression of many disease processes. So I will also share about that as well today and how we get to that place. So let's start with the beginning of what is our immune system and how does it work, and what are the kind of components of it. So again, the way that I think of the immune system's purpose is I think of it as a system, an organ system in our body that is responsible for protecting us against hostile substances in our environment that can potentially interface with our body, enter our body, and spread colonies and build into large populations, just essentially, taking over the nutrients in our body to make colonies which do harm to our body. That's the standard theory of what the immune system, is there to protect against happening. And so we have all these different types of cells in our immune system that are designed to protect and not allow those types of pathogens to get into and settle into our body. And obviously, when we talk about the immune system and how they're designed to protect against infection, we want to talk about how does infection get started. Well, first of all, we accept and acknowledge that now that we have microscopes and ways of detecting really tiny things, that indeed our world is full of bugs. And these bugs live in harmony with us. They're part of our world. In fact, we wouldn't be alive if it weren't for all these tiny microscopic bugs. And where we really tie into that is our gut, which is full of microscopic bugs, trillions and trillions of them, 10 times more of them in our gut than there are cells in our body. So indeed, these bugs that are out in the world are not bad. They decompose from a fungus standpoint, they decompose all of our live matter in our forests and on the earth. And same thing with the bacteria, do a lot of that purpose as well. So they break things down for us and make nutrients available to us to grow plants and thrive and flourish. They are intricately connected to pretty much every animal and plant in nature, has a harmonious and I'll say mutualistic relationship with microbes, with very small bugs, bacteria, viruses, fungus. And so I want to start this meeting by acknowledging that these are our friends and we wouldn't survive without them. However, some of them can cause us problems and create trouble in our bodies when they grow into large colonies and proportions. And it really depends on how those microbes enter our body, as well as the state of our immune system and our vitality as a whole as to what happens about those microbes, interfacing with our body. The ways they generally tend to enter our body is the skin is one method, but usually only when the skin is compromised, which is, only if you have active, disruptions of the skin barrier, like with cuts. The skin itself is a pretty non-transferable medium in terms of microbes getting into the inside of our body, which is where they like to set up, colonies. However, pathogens can also just set up colonies right on our skin surface. And indeed, that happens with versions of fungal skin infections and bacterial skin infections. So that can happen. But the more likely route of entry into our body is through our mucous membranes. So that's through our mouth, our nose, our ears, our sinuses, and our gut and lungs are the other big mucous membrane surfaces, as we call them. Those are more permeable surfaces, and it's much easier for pathogens to enter our tissues there and set up, colonies, basically, or what we call infection. So once pathogens, let's say they get into our body and they establish colonies in any of those tissues, then, first of all, in order to do that, pathogens have evaded several mechanisms of defense. So there's all sorts of what we call innate immune cells that are designed to make it hostile for pathogens to get into our body. Lysozymes, defensins, mucins, certain sorts of generalized what we call macrophages. These are cells that just attack things blindly once they, attempt to enter the body. And so there are many just generalized compounds that our body has to protect us against pathogens ever getting a foothold in our body. Once these pathogens really start to invade and set up colonies, we have this whole other side of our immune system, which is called the adaptive immune system. And this part of the immune system is where our body notices there's an infection starting, and it's able to intelligently craft a response to infection that is very specific to the exact pathogen that's infected our body. And it actually generates what are called killer T cells and antibodies that bind up and chew up those pathogens very specifically to that exact microbe. And there are things called dendritic cells and antigen presenting cells that basically sample those pathogens, bring those pathogen samples to the immune centers, which are called our lymph nodes. And then we produce these unique immune cells to respond against those invasive pathogens, colonies, and overall take them over, kill them, and snuff them out. Now, that process of building an adaptive response takes a few days. So I'm sure many of you have had this phenomenon where you start to feel a little sick, and then you feel more and more sick and more intensely ill. And then 3 or 4 days into it, you feel the worst, and then you start to turn the corner and feel better. Well, the action of what's going on there is as you start to feel sick, the infection has already been set up in your body. So it's been sitting there for probably a few days, incubating and growing, but now it's really starting to cause problems in your body and actually cause dysfunction. And that's what, and now the immune system adaptively is waking up to mount a cellular response, an adaptive response. And the crescendo peak of your symptoms is often when the immune system is really, kind of building that peak response, which generates a lot of what we call inflammation. So this is a key concept of how our immune system works, that when we try to take on pathogens, the way in which we do so intelligently, the immune system cranks up the temperature, and it cranks up the vigor and enzyme activity in our body and the vigor of our blood. And it allows that immune response to be more aggressive when there's more heat. And then when we're having the actual immune response, it's a pretty high inflammation setting when that response goes on, when it's trying to kill the microbes. So you have swelling, irritation, pain, redness. These are very common features of any acute response to the immune system trying to clear a pathogen. So those are very classical parts of the immune response. So the weird thing to think about is the infection has already been going on for several days before you even start to notice symptoms. And the symptoms you are noticing are not from the pathogen, but more likely from your immune system ramping up in fighting against the pathogen. So one of the things that I get really discouraged about conventional healthcare is that they often try to suppress those symptoms that the immune system is creating to clear the pathogen. They give Tylenol or ibuprofen to suppress a fever, which is an intelligent response by the body to help clear the pathogen. And so really our goal in naturopathic medicine is to support that adaptive, appropriate immune response. And if the immune response gets so severe that it's causing other deeper harm in the body, to try to mitigate and kind of, meter the response, which we can do in several non-suppressive ways, not involving, the use of anti-fever drugs. And one of the big ways I like to use is a neutral bath or cold compresses over the forehead. I also like to use fasting, which is the abstinence of eating food, to basically minimize the energies the body's putting towards digestion. And it will tend to moderate a fever and help the body stabilize much more quickly. I also really want to make sure the bowels are moving and we reduce any sort of toxins that are in the colon, so that the body's not dealing with that, that kind of toxin burden while it's trying to fight an infection alongside. So these are very old naturopathic principles of how to manage an acute illness, not suppress the symptoms, but support the immune process. And so what kind of comes along with that, of course, is why do we get these, how do these pathogens get in and get established in the first place? What allows them to get past that innate immune surveillance and establish in our system? And what is it that if you go to a party that a few people get sick at, but not everybody, why is it that some people get sick if everybody was exposed to the pathogen? And that's a really key concept and principle, because what we're getting to the heart of is the differing theories of what's called the microbial theory and the terrain theory. Now, being on the heels of the pandemic, this has been a big part of our lives of late. We've been focusing on viruses and how they can cause harm, or we should say, if the immune system doesn't take care of them appropriately, how they can cause harm, or if the immune system responds inappropriately, how they can cause harm. Well, a big part of that theory in modern medicine and conventional medicine relies upon the microbial theory, which states that if there's a pathogen, then the pathogen causes the disease. So all you have to have is an exposure to the pathogen to cause disease. That's the microbial theory. And so all of the eggs of the basket of that theory are reduce exposure potential to the pathogen, and kill the pathogen. So in the pandemic, we saw our response was, let's isolate ourselves, let's not see each other, let's put masks on, let's prevent exposure to this virus. And then secondarily, if we get the virus, let's use drugs that have an action of killing the virus. So that's the microbial theory. The terrain theory is, I think, in my opinion, as a naturopathic physician, more accurate and a little more complex in that we acknowledge that the microbe has to be present to cause the illness, but you also need another variable, which is called a terrain that is susceptible. Or if we're talking about weeds in a garden, the weeds being the pathogen, you need a soil that is basically inviting to that weed to grow. And if you don't have a soil that will nurture the weed, then the weed's not going to grow. So the idea of the terrain theory of infectious disease is that you need both the pathogen and a susceptible host or terrain of a person in order to have a disease. And so that's where the idea of being at a party with someone being really sick and only having some people get sick, even if you all were exposed, the terrain theory makes so much sense because some of those people were susceptible to that virus or bacteria and some weren't. So in my opinion, with infectious disease, and as we move into winter and where we have more pathogens easily entering our bodies, is we want to talk about what has to do with what makes that terrain really strong and healthy and vital and resilient and inhospitable to pathogens, and what makes it vulnerable and compromised and a ground for pathogens to breed and thrive on. And so that really has a lot to do with how our immune system gets disturbed. And I'm going to talk about all the different ways that tends to happen in the minutes ahead. Now, something really important to understand about the immune system that I didn't explain yet, but that's really crucial as part of its functionality, is that the immune system, one of the big components of its functionality is what is called our lymphatic system. So lymphatic system is part of the immune system, and it has a couple of organs, the spleen, the thymus, and then it has all of the lymphatic tissue, which are these channels like blood vessels that run all throughout our body. And there's little hubs of those channels called lymph nodes, where the lymph goes and congregates, where that example I gave, where that sampling happens of pathogens, and the immune system sends out its marching orders through those lymph nodes. And that lymph system is essentially a big filtration system in our body that removes debris and toxins and pathogens and waste products. It also circulates our immune cells and tissues to get the immune tissues and cells to where they need to be to take care of our body. And there's as much lymph fluid in our body as there is blood fluid in our veins and arteries. So there's a tremendous amount of this material, and science kind of poorly understands the lymph system. So I mentioned the lymph system because it's a really critical part of the immune function, and it's one of the big places things can go wrong and make us more susceptible to harm and infection. And very simply put, I'll just jump right into that pathway. The lymph system being this important filtration system to remove toxins and pathogens and debris, like, for example, in a fish tank, you have a filtration system there. Now, many of you probably can imagine what happens if your filter breaks in your fish tank. You've got dead fish in there pretty soon thereafter. The water gets cloudy, it gets murky, it gets gunky, and then the conditions for living don't exist and all the fish die. So we can make an analogous analogy, I should say, to our lymphatic system in our human body, that when our lymph is not moving and circulating appropriately, toxins kind of muck up our body, pathogens are able to just recirculate and thrive, and we get sick. So one of the big principles in prevention of infectious disease is make sure the blood and lymph is moving vigorously. And also one of the big principles of when you have infection or acute illness is move the blood and lymph really vigorously so you can remove that toxicity and debris that's basically feeding the illness. So again, we don't want a broken filter. We want a really healthy, actively circulating, functioning filter in our body, and that is our lymph system. So one might ask, well, what do we do about that? How do we keep our lymph system really healthy? So number one, you move your body. When we move our muscles, when we are active with our fitness, when we're physically active, that massages our lymph and circulatory blood vessels to be more proactive. It makes our heart work harder to pump our blood better, to move our lymph better. So one of the fundamental things we can all do to have a healthier immune system and also to prevent illness and then help illness resolve quicker is to be active. A variety of activity, right? Like not just vigorous physical activity, but gentle physical activity, walking, hiking, biking, swimming, yoga, tai chi, more intense things, doing competitive sports, recreational sports, gym work, high intensity training, CrossFit training. I mean, it goes on and on. You kind of pick what you're resonant with, but I think it's key that we all look at, especially winters, and we're trying to stay healthy and not get illnesses, that we do a lot of physical activity and we have a strategy to do that consistently. It's a big philosophy of mine with all things health that if you're not moving well, your health is going to decline significantly. In any kind of disease presentation, moving the blood, moving the lymph is going to be key to restoration of health. And exercise is our most fundamental, simple way to do that. Now, there's a lot of other really awesome ways to move the blood and lymph. I call them more passive methods. My big one that I'm a total nerd about and I ascribe to deeply in my personal life is hydrotherapy, the alternation of hot and cold to the skin surface to activate the opening and closing of the vessels and the pumping action of the lymph and blood vessels. I personally have a hot tub and a cold plunge I use every single day, October through April, where I spend 3 to 5 minutes in the hot and then go into the ice cold plunge for a minute and then go back into the hot and back into the cold and back into the hot and back into the cold, and always ending on cold. This is an incredible way to pump your immune system up by activating the blood and lymph. It does a great job of removing waste debris and bringing fresh nutrients and immune cells to the tissue. A quick and easy way to do it, if you don't have a hot tub or a sauna or a cold plunge, is contrasting in the shower. Hot and cold alternation to the skin surface, several cycles throughout the shower, or just ending on cold at the end of your shower for about 30 to 60 seconds. Ideally, you move the water up towards your heart from all of your extremities and then step out of the shower and dry off. This is an easy change all of us can make that bathe regularly, and it does a really good thing for the immune system. Another adjunctive that I love is dry skin brushing. You can get a dry skin brush for $5 here at the clinic or at a health food store or online. You brush the lymph, which a lot of our lymph is on the surface near the skin, back towards the heart. Take about 30 seconds to do it once a day, and it's a really tangible way to improve that lymph movement. Another great thing that is awesome for lymph is body work and acupuncture. Both are incredible modalities. Body work, I mean massage therapy, chiropractic, Reiki, craniosacral therapy, as I said, acupuncture, all of these modalities, physical therapy, having a good practitioner in your life that you invest ideally proactively in. I see an incredible craniosacral massage therapist every month, as well as an acupuncturist. I think those go a long way to activate your circulation and your blood flow and your lymph and reduce the likelihood of stagnation of toxins and accumulation of infection. So those are a couple of little things that I really want to talk about how big circulation is in this whole concept. It brings me and ties into another big concept of the terrain theory and the idea of weakening terrain and what causes that. The big concept I'm going to bring up is the concept of toxemia. And that is a huge thing in naturopathic medicine and the understanding of health and disease, which is the accumulation of toxins in the body creates more susceptibility to disease coming and dysfunction coming into the body, both acutely from the acquiring of viral or bacterial or fungal infections, essentially seeing those toxins accumulating in our body as breeding ground for those toxins, or as, the toxins as breeding ground for those microbes, or secondarily, as all of those toxins accumulating, being something that the body starts to get poisoned by, and it creates a response to try to get rid of those toxins that often takes the form of symptoms of immune dysregulation and inflammation. And so with chronic diseases, a lot of what I believe we see is the immune system and the body's intelligent response of trying to get rid of toxins we're building up in our bloodstream and tissues by trying to discharge them. And the symptoms of the disease are really that intelligent process of the body trying to remove toxins. So one of the problems again there is, what if the lymph and the circulation is not working well? Well, that's how we move things, right? So if all that's stagnant and broken down, the filter's broken, we're not going to be able to get rid of toxins nearly as easily. So those toxins accumulate more readily, which is why, going back to circulation, it is, and lymphatic movement, it's so crucial to have this working well. Of course, the other end of it is, how do we accumulate toxins and how does that happen to our body? And there's a few ways that I think is most prominent, and I'm probably going to talk about the most prominent ones. The first big one is through our gut and what we eat. Our modern American diet is radically different from our ancestors. We have a lot of processed foods. We have a lot of sugar, refined starches. We have a lot of fake foods that aren't even real foods, that are synthetic chemicals that, big corporations have created. And when we put those substances in our body regularly, they don't get used efficiently, and they generate a toxin burden in our tissues, in our gut, but also in our tissues. And that is an epidemic problem now with our fast food, processed food culture that we live in. We're constantly eating these highly processed, devitalized, nutrition void foods as the bulk of our intakes. And this is the large reason that the body is so susceptible to both acute and chronic disease, where, it burdens our system with toxicity, and then we have to try to attempt to get rid of the toxins. And that's what the chronic disease manifestations are. And, the big ones like that are most obvious are sugar, alcohol, tobacco. I would say cow dairy in most of its forms is very hard to assimilate for most people. Modern wheat and wheat products is a great example. Processed corn, processed potato products, big issues in terms of the lack of nutrient density and the propensity to cause toxicity in the body. And so a lot of dysregulation happens at this level of just building these food-derived toxins into our system. And then there's a lot of environmental toxins, poor water quality, agricultural toxins, drugs. When we take medications, they make toxins, and our body has to process those, and it accumulates those. The air we breathe, the solvents we use, there's just a lot of these substances, and that all adds to our toxic burden. It all makes our immune system less proactive, it makes our immune system less intelligent. So there's a lot of these physical substrates that we take in, again, largely through the food we eat, because we're doing that all day, every day, that causes disturbance and disharmony to our immune system and builds a toxic burden that makes us need to get rid of those toxins through symptoms, or has disease be established acutely via infections where those toxins are residing and hanging out in our tissues. So that is a generalized premise of how toxicity builds up. And essentially, my theory is that the immune system does one of two things. It either rallies to try to get rid of those toxins because it sees them as hostile and generates inflammation responses. So you could call eczema the immune system's effort to discharge toxins, or you could call a chronic sinus congestion a way the body tries to discharge toxins. You could even describe heavy menses as a causation of that, or a driver of the body discharging toxins. You could call migraine headaches an example of that. And the list goes on and on. Arthritis in the joints, swelling of the ankles and arms, amplified pressure in the bloodstream, high blood pressure. These are all disturbances that I think are generated from the immune system trying to get rid of a toxin response. And it gets exacerbated if our lymph and blood is not circulating and clearing well as the organs that our blood and lymph bring those toxins to, which is our liver, our lungs, our bowels, and our kidneys. So that's one of those things where I said, in my experience with acute illness, for example, if the body can't get rid of the toxins, it's a much bigger issue and much more likely to cause harm. So emptying the colon with an acute illness is one of the best things you can do. Making sure you're hydrated regularly, but also during the acute illness, is one of the best things you can do, because that keeps the kidneys flushing and keeps helping easily remove toxins from our body. With the liver, that's why we like to rest the digestion with an acute illness and do kind of a fast, because it unburdens the liver of processing all of our foods and all the stuff from our digestion, so it can reroute its resources to getting rid of other toxins and helping the immune system. So a lot of intelligence there to that process of supporting elimination organs and supporting circulation. Now, another really big thing that dysregulates the immune system is this other huge part of our well-being that we haven't talked at all about. And that is this big organ in our body called our mind. And I shouldn't just say our mind, because to me, our mind is not our brain, but it's an integrated part of who we are, the level of psychological, spiritual, and emotional processing of our life experience. And how we have evolved in our modern world, essentially, to having a tremendous amount of toxicity that we burden our mind with from an emotional and responsibility standpoint and busyness standpoint. There is an epidemic, like our food epidemic, of strain on our mind, spirit, and emotional body like never before. And my observation about that, and the science does bear this out, is that that causes its own version of toxicity and confusion and disturbance in the body. And so one of the big ways that happens is that when we have an elevated fear or worry or overwhelm, or just, kind of like rallying our stress response to get through life, to get things done, to focus on the things our mind's able to perceive and worry about, whether it's future or past. All of those things, those thoughts, precipitate the creation of chemicals in our brain and tissues and nervous system, which trickle down into our tissues and cause changes to our tissues. And obviously, I'm really speaking to the like more stress, overwhelm, worry, fear, suspicion, grief, types of feelings and thoughts, as well as just constantly overly engaging our brain and overly activating our mind in the doing of things and the accomplishing of things intellectually versus being, versus watching a sunset, playing around with your kids in your yard, doing things creative, just being present and not needing to achieve or do anything, in being centered in your being and in a place of peace and relaxation. Our culture and society more and more has less and less of that as we evolve as species, and it's having a massive impact on how our health and organ systems and tissues are affected. And the direct corollary there is that when we're in that active, busy mind state, an amped up emotional state, especially in a chronic nature, we essentially are tapping into an overactivated, chronically activated, what we call fight or flight response, instead of what we're designed and evolved to be in, which is a chronically activated rest and digest response. We're only supposed to use that fight or flight response very transiently in short bursts. And so when that happens chronically, which it does to many of us, a few key things happen. Number one, we lose tone, nerve supply, blood flow, resources to our digestive process. That can shut down our elimination. That can make our assimilation of our food much weaker. And it can also cause all sorts of disharmony to the gut immune interface, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Second thing it does is it shuts down a lot of our hormonal systems. It shuts down our reproductive hormone systems. It imbalances our thyroid and adrenal hormone systems. And those have major overlaying roles in our health in general, as well as our immune function, because our hormonal systems they're agents of many actions, and they do a lot of communicating of the body to appropriate system responses. The third big thing when our fight or flight tone is overactivated is it makes our immune system go haywire. And it's really interesting what it does. It both suppresses our immune system's ability to detect and appropriately address infectious pathogens, both in a preventive way as well as when there's actively established colonization. So that's why stress is so hard on making us, again, terrain and susceptibility. That's part of the terrain, right? Is amplified stress state more susceptible to disease or acute illness. On the other hand, the amplified stress response also causes a confusion in our immune system and often will cause our immune system to respond inappropriately and look at things that are safe and friendly as something that is hostile. And so my observation with that is a lot of, the stress response can often precipitate what we call autoimmune or dysregulatory immune responses. So you've heard of these things: Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, Hashimoto's thyroid disease, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, ankylosing spondylitis, and the list goes on of these. I call them immune dysregulatory conditions, but they're known as autoimmune conditions also. And there is an epidemic of growth in autoimmune conditions in our society. I think in no small part because of how stress confuses and disturbs our immune system, especially times of especially intense stress. And so that's a real key thing around allergies and autoimmunity and a lot of these immune dysregulatory conditions where our immune system malfunctions and attacks its own tissues. What's really going on and what's really at the root of it. So while there's lots of ways to dampen down the immune response, whether with natural substances or drugs, a really important thing is to recognize if we really reorganize the stress response and change the tone, intensity, and nature of it, you can turn off that confusion and dysregulatory process going on with the immune system. So that's something I work a lot with, to get to the cause, to get to the root of things with people when their medical condition is one of those more immune dysregulatory processes. Is I do look very closely at the stress response, stress forces in one's life, and how to, comprehensively support someone understanding that better, changing the ways they relate to it, kind of address it, and hopefully, when possible, change their environment so there's not so much stress interfacing with them constantly. Because in my opinion, stress causes, in a chronic way, causes in many ways most of these immune dysregulatory and even health disturbing processes in our bodies. And in my opinion, also, our medical system is not well equipped to acknowledge, understand that, and give people tangible tools to engage with it as an empowerment to better their health. They tend to more go to the level with the immune system malfunctioning is, well, shoot, it's malfunctioning. Let's just suppress it. Let's turn it off. And they have these really scary side effect filled drugs to use in that regard. So that's fundamentally different in my approach. Is I don't want to just suppress the messenger, which is your immune system freaking out because of those deeper causes. I want to listen to the freak out as a way to go looking for those deeper causes. And that's what naturopathic medicine is to me. And what I think all medicine should be at the heart of things is the pursuit of that. Now, the other big arena where this immune confusion emanates from, also where a lot of toxicity builds up, is at the gut level, in the interface with the gut and the immune system. And that's a key understanding that, remember I said that there's trillions of bugs that live in our gut? Well, those bugs are interfacing with the foods we eat and the stress we're experiencing to be in a certain sort of equilibrium. And there's really friendly protective bugs that help us live and thrive. And there can be bugs that, if we have too many of them, can cause disturbance, dysregulation of the immune system, and toxicity. And there's some that are just always going to cause disturbance and toxicity. So when a combination of factors is present, this can lead to a disturbance of those microbes. And a lot of it is usually a combination of nutrition and stress lead to a imbalancing of the microbes that live in our gut, which leads to toxins being created, which leads to a permeable or inflamed, broken up intestinal lining, which then leads to those toxins interfacing directly with our immune tissues that are all sitting around the gut. Remember, I said the immune system has all these nodes of communication and protection? Well, they tend to conglomerate around the mucous membranes, the places where the outside world is exposed to our inside world. And the gut is the biggest place where this happens. So at the level of the gut, this is where a lot of, you could see first of all, toxins can enter the bloodstream and tissue, but also where a lot of this immune reactivity and response and confusion gets generated. So that's on a mechanistic level, kind of like I explained the mechanism of how stress physically causes disharmony. I'm explaining on a mechanistic level how inappropriate diet and high sugar and processed food lead to the generation of toxins and dysregulated inflamed immune response at the level of the gut. That's not always felt as digestive symptoms. Sometimes the digestive symptoms are minimal, but it might be expressed peripherally as, something like headaches or something like sinus congestion. So it's that immune kind of weakening and confusion combo that we get to that place. And the gut is a big place where that occurs. So anything that, essentially is a toxin to both our digestive process and our tissues, can lead to a lot of these disturbances and toxin accumulation. And don't forget, right, drugs can also be put in this category, whether they're recreational prescription. Some of the biggest prescription ones are antibiotics and steroids. Steroids are things that shut down the immune inflammation response, but they also shut down our gut health and create disharmony in the gut flora. So do antibiotics in a major way. So I'm very, very, very hesitant to deploy those tools only at utmost need. And it's why it's kind of a vicious cycle with illnesses acutely with antibiotics. If the gut flora is where a lot of the vigor, vitality, and balance of your immune system is coming from, and you treat an acute illness like a sinus infection or a bronchial infection with wiping it with an antibiotic, you might clear that infection for the moment, but you weaken your immune system overall. So the net effect is a more vulnerable immune system, a more susceptible terrain to be exposed to further infection and harm down the road. And so again, luckily with naturopathic medicine, we have a lot of other ways to look at this and work with this to reduce the need for those kind of interventions. Suppressions is what I call them. And so I've already talked a lot about enhancing circulation. I've started to talk about enhancing the elimination organs of breath work, of getting lots of fiber and healthy whole foods in your diet so your colon's functioning well and your liver's getting rid of toxins well. Talked about good hydration, half your body weight in ounces with water every day. Great thing you can do to, enhance health, balance, remove toxins, balance the immune system. We've talked a little bit in the stress realm, right? Just scratch the surface really because it's such an individual conversation. But if you're struggling with your immune system, if you're struggling with symptoms your immune system is creating chronically, you got to go look at your stress and say, how am I relating to my stress? What am I even stressing about? Like, bring some accountability and consciousness to seeing this as a pivotal part of your health and well-being, and what's nurturing happiness and well-being, and what is causing disturbance and disharmony, and how are you relating to those things, right? Because we talk about stress, it's not the stress itself, it's how we relate to and work with the things that create stress for us. And it's not getting the stress stuck inside of us. As a little aside, I feel like all of us can do with a good dose of more vulnerability and asking for help in our culture. And that's one of the really beautiful things I see transpire with people in their healing journey is when they start to talk about how they feel, how they struggle, how they have stress, which is such a human thing, and they ask for support and help with it, their health improves because they don't hold and bury stress in such a harming way in their body. We've scratched the surface of nutrition, but we could go on forever and ever with that as a lens through which the body accumulates toxins when we do that inappropriately, and how those toxins accumulating are much of what cause immune dysregulatory discharge processes or compromise to the immune system, especially when it comes to the gut interface. So this isn't a lecture we'll go into depth, but living to eat, or I should say, eating to live is a really important principle. And being attentive and putting energy and care and time into the foods you eat and seeking the help of a doctor, like a naturopathic doctor, I should say, because we're the ones who are nerds and experts in this, to really help you get to the bottom of what food is the best for you, what food feels the best, what are the methodologies we can go about learning that. There's so much to offer there to figure that out for yourself, and then going out and doing the hard work of applying that to your life in a consistent manner. I use the blood type diet a lot. I use food sensitivity testing. I use modified fasting and elimination challenges. These are all beautiful ways to understand that in a more discerning way individually, and that can make all the difference in a chronic or acute health patterning to limit the propensity to illness, both, like I said, acutely and chronically. So really taking food as medicine as a kind of concept. Now, in the last few minutes, I am happy to talk about some agents that balance immune function, because yes, as naturopathic doctors, we also do use natural medicines that support our body's immune function, vital force, vitality, and there are some really good things to consider. First and foremost, especially this time of year, vitamin D. Vitamin D, our body makes from exposure to a lot of sunlight. We don't make it in the fall and winter, especially because we use a lot of clothes and we live indoors. The only way to get vitamin D is to make it through your skin from the sun, or you can supplement it. I am a big fan of supplementing it because we know how broadly vitamin D acts in the body to not only balance the immune system, but enhance immune vigor, especially against pathogens. And it also really enhances mood. So a lot of people deal with seasonal blues, and vitamin D is huge for that. So huge fan of everyone taking vitamin D. Adults, I tend to recommend 2,000 to 4,000 units a day with meals. So that is first and foremost what I love to recommend in terms of a supplement. I am also a big fan of recommending a supplement called N-acetylcysteine, both as a preventive as well as an active treatment when our immune system gets strained. And I like it so much because it does a few things for our body. One thing is it really supports liver detox pathways. So our liver's constantly getting rid of toxins, right? And NAC helps those detox pathways to remove toxins by turning into glutathione. At higher doses, which is the dose is about 1,200 milligrams twice a day, it also acts as a mucolytic, or it scrapes off microbes from landing on our mucous membranes, or if they've already landed, helps clear them off. So when we talk about acute infections, I love higher doses of NAC to help address that. When we're talking about the immune system being way too revved up and being too inflamed, again, I've talked about some lifestyle ways, fasting, hydrotherapy, having a bowel movement to kind of help empty the colon, to help like diminish that irritation and inflammation response. Those are the best things you can do, but there is really good efficacy of a few herbs. One of the biggest ones I'm thinking about is curcumin, which is the active extract of turmeric. So I really like using a compound called theracurmin and also Mariva, which are medical grade curcumin extracts in high potency, to decrease the overall state of inflammation of the immune system. Again, we're still acting on the level of the endpoint inflammation, but sometimes it helps to do some of those more proactive things when our body really needs those extra kind of supports to get through a tough moment. So I didn't want to leave this meeting without mentioning any immune tools, but I wanted the brunt of the meeting to be about, hey, how does our immune system work? What disturbs it? What does that disturbance really mean from a naturopathic perspective? And what are some of the lifestyle ways we can begin to take focus and take ownership of to create a higher vitality, a lower toxic burden, a more intelligent, vigorous, and balanced immune system? So that's what I got to share today. I appreciate you listening in. I didn't see any questions come up. So I'll just appreciate that. Hopefully you all enjoyed this chat, and I hope you have a really good rest of your day. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.